Russia is retreating, not regrouping, not repositioning, retreating. For the first time since August of 2024, the Russian army has lost more ground in a single month than it has taken. 116 square kilometers, gone. Stripped out of Vladimir Putin's hands and dragged back across the line by a force the Kremlin spent 2 years telling its own population was on the verge of collapse. And it did not happen evenly across the front. It happened on one axis, one sector, one direction where Russian commanders thought they had finally cracked the door open into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and instead walked their best assault formations into a kill sack engineered by Ukraine's air assault forces. 300 square kilometers retaken. 9 settlements cleared, 2,653 Russian soldiers killed in roughly 60 days of fighting along a single operational corridor. Let that sink in for a moment. This is the front Vladimir Putin personally promised his generals would deliver him the political victory he could announce on state television. This is the axis his propagandists had already pre-written headlines for, and it has now become the place where the entire 2026 spring offensive narrative quietly went to die. This is not a story about a few liberated villages on a map most Western viewers cannot pronounce. This is a case study in what happens when an army built on industrial age assumptions collides with a defending force that has spent 2.5 years rewriting the operational manual in real time. What you are witnessing on the Oleksandrivka axis is not a counterattack. It is the visible surface of a structural failure that has been gathering pressure underneath the Russian war machine for months and has now broken through into the open. And it gets even more serious from here. Pull the lens back. To understand why Putin has been forced to retreat on this specific front, you have to understand what Russia thought it was doing on this front in the first place. Rewind to the late autumn of 2025 and the opening weeks of 2026. The Kremlin's plan, leaked through multiple Russian military bloggers and confirmed by Ukrainian intelligence assessments, was ambitious in scope and embarrassingly conventional in design. 13 sectors. Simultaneous pressure from the Sumy border in the north all the way down through the Pokrovsk salient, across the Dobropilya approaches, into the Oleksandrivka corridor, and finally pushing west toward the administrative boundary of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The strategic prize was political. Russia had spent the entire negotiating cycle of late 2025 demanding the recognition of all 4 annexed oblasts. To make that demand credible at any future negotiating table, Putin needed his army to be visibly bleeding into a 5th Ukrainian region. Dnipropetrovsk was the trophy. Oleksandrivka was the door. On paper, the assumptions favored Russia. Mass. Manpower replenishment from contract recruitment running, according to Western estimates, at 30 to 40,000 new contracts per month. Artillery superiority in some sectors approaching 3 to 1. A deepening glide bomb campaign that throughout 2025 had hollowed out Ukrainian fixed positions one by one. The Russian general staff looked at the numbers and concluded what generals raised on Soviet doctrine always conclude, that pressure across a wide front, sustained long enough, must eventually produce collapse somewhere. They were not wrong about the math. They were wrong about the variable. The hidden variable was not how much weight Russia could push forward. It was what Ukraine had built behind the lines while Russia was pushing. And this is the part the mainstream framing of this war has consistently missed. Coverage in 2025 fixated on Russian gains measured in square kilometers per day, and those numbers did look ugly. 9.76 square kilometers per day on average through 2025, according to Institute for the Study of War Mapping. Headlines treated those gains as a trend line that would simply continue. Western commentators began openly discussing how much territory Ukraine might have to concede. What that framing missed entirely is that the rate of Russian advance had already begun collapsing months before April of 2026. By the first third of 2026, that 9.76 figure had crashed to 2.9 square kilometers per day. That is not a slowdown. That is a 68% collapse in offensive momentum across the entire theater. And the only reason that collapse was not visible to casual news consumers is because the absolute size of the front, over 1,000 kilometers, disguises the loss of operational tempo until it becomes catastrophic in a specific sector. Oleksandrivka is where it became catastrophic. This matters enormously, and I want you to understand exactly why at the strategic level. When an offensive army's daily advance rate falls below the regeneration rate of the defender's prepared positions, the offensive does not simply slow down. It begins running into fortifications that did not exist when the operation was planned. Every kilometer of trench, every drone nest, every fiber optic relay station, every minefield the Ukrainians lay down faster than the Russians can punch through becomes a separate engagement the Russian formation now has to fight from scratch. The math compounds against the attacker. This is what doctrine writers call a culminating point, the moment at which the offensive can no longer generate enough combat power to overcome what it is being asked to overcome. Russia's 2026 spring offensive reached its culminating point, not in late summer, not in mid-campaign, but within the first 8 to 10 weeks of starting. And the place it broke first was the Oleksandrivka corridor. What happens next changes everything. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the milestones along this front are not random. They form a chronology of doctrinal failure that any serious military historian will be studying for the next 20 years. Start in February of 2026, Ukraine's air assault forces, operating in coordination with the 8th Corps and elements of the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps, began a quiet, methodical counter-operation along the southern flank of what Russian planners had treated as their most promising salient. There was no televised announcement, no grand offensive press conference, no leaflet drops. The Ukrainian command had learned in the brutal lessons of 2023 that any counteroffensive announced is a counteroffensive defeated. So this one was simply executed. By the 3rd week of February, the first public confirmation surfaced. Over 300 square kilometers of territory recovered, 8 settlements cleared, and a Russian salient that had taken 6 months of grinding assaults to create was simply rolled back in a matter of weeks. By late March, that number had climbed to 9 settlements liberated along the Oleksandrivka direction alone, with 2,653 Russian soldiers confirmed killed in that operational window. Read those numbers carefully. That is not a skirmish casualty rate. That is something approaching the loss of an entire Russian motorized rifle brigade in roughly 60 days of fighting over a single salient. Across the broader fortress belt operations through this same period, Russian losses were estimated by Ukrainian general staff and independent analysts at approximately 6,000 soldiers absorbed against Ukraine's fortified Donetsk defensive line. 6,000. For movement measured in some weeks in hundreds of meters. In one March assault near the fortress belt, Ukrainian reporting documented 405 Russian casualties out of roughly 500 personnel committed, an 81% loss rate. Doctrinally, that is not an assault, that is a sacrificial waste. And this is the moment where the mainstream framing of the war begins to look almost embarrassingly out of date. Throughout 2025 and into early 2026, the dominant Western narrative was that Russia had absorbed its losses, mobilized its industrial base, and was now grinding inexorably forward against a Ukrainian army running short of men, missiles, and political support. That framing was not entirely wrong about Ukrainian constraints, but it was deeply wrong about what those constraints meant. Ukraine was not running out of war. Ukraine was running out of the kind of war it could no longer afford to fight. And it was systematically replacing it with a different kind of war, one Russia is structurally incapable of matching. This is the hidden military variable. While Russia spent 2025 throwing infantry and armor at fixed positions in a desperate attempt to convert mass into territory, Ukraine spent 2025 industrializing drone warfare at a scale no military in human history has ever attempted. By the opening of 2026, Ukrainian domestic drone production was running into the millions of units per year across multiple platforms. First-person view tactical drones, fiber optic strike drones immune to electronic warfare, long-range deep strike systems capable of reaching targets 1,500 kilometers inside Russian territory, naval drones that have functionally driven the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, and unmanned ground vehicles now appearing on the Pokrovsk front delivering supplies, evacuating wounded, and mounting heavy machine guns against Russian infantry. The Ukrainian battlefield is no longer a battlefield in the 20th century sense. It is a sensor-saturated, autonomous strike-saturated, lethality-dense environment in which the cost of moving forward as a Russian conscript has become unsupportable. And it gets even more serious from here, because what happens on the front is now feeding directly back into what is happening inside the Russian state. Pull the lens back to the industrial and economic level. The retreat on the Oleksandrivka axis is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring against the backdrop of the most sustained Ukrainian deep strike campaign of the entire war. Throughout the spring of 2026, Ukrainian long-range systems have been systematically dismantling the Russian refining sector. Oil refineries from Volgograd to Ryazan, from Tuapse to Saratov, from Novokuybishevsk to the depths of Tatarstan have been hit, often multiple times, with strike patterns designed not for spectacle, but for repair denial. Russian gasoline shortages have appeared in occupied Crimea, in southern Russian oblasts, in cities the Kremlin assured its population were beyond the reach of any Ukrainian weapon. State-level fuel prices have moved. Regional governors have begun rationing. And the Russian central budget, already running a deficit measured in trillions of rubles, is being squeezed simultaneously from the revenue side by lost refining capacity and from the expenditure side by the staggering personnel costs of an offensive that is not producing territory. This is the broader lesson here, and you will not hear it stated this clearly on cable news. Modern industrial states do not lose wars because they run out of soldiers. They lose wars because the cost per meter of advancing exceeds what the political system can absorb without fracturing. Russia has not yet fractured, but the visible cost per meter on the Oleksandrivka axis, soldiers killed, equipment destroyed, fuel burned, ammunition expended, political credit consumed, has crossed a threshold that the Russian General Staff is now quietly admitting in classified briefings cannot be sustained against the current Ukrainian counterforce. That is what a forced retreat actually is. It is not a tactical decision made by a battalion commander under fire. It is a strategic admission walking up the chain that the math no longer closes. The question was whether Ukraine could convert that arithmetic collapse into a recognizable operational victory the world could see. And in April of 2026, the answer arrived in the form of cold-sourced data. 116 square kilometers, a net loss of Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory across the entire theater. The first such monthly loss since August of 2024. The first time in over 20 months that the Kremlin stenographers could not point at the daily maps and claim progress. And that net figure conceals an even more important detail. Most of that loss did not come from Ukrainian gains scattered across the front. It came from one operational direction, the Oleksandrivka axis. The same axis Putin had personally greenlit as his political prize. This is the moment we are watching, and I want you to mark it. We are seeing, on a specific sector of a specific front, the first clear demonstration that Russia's offensive ceiling has been mapped, measured, and breached. What Ukrainian intelligence has been arguing in closed Western briefings for over a year, that Russia is paying offensive prices for defensive results, is no longer a forecast. It is a documented monthly data point. Now let me walk you through the climactic operation itself, because the way Ukraine executed this retreat-forcing maneuver tells you everything about why Russia cannot replicate the result going the other way. The Oleksandrivka counterstrike was not a frontal assault. It was a textbook example of what military theorists call deep operational shaping, degrading the enemy's ability to fight before the close engagement begins. Phase 1, executed across late January and February, was a sustained interdiction campaign against Russian logistics nodes feeding the salient, fuel trucks, ammunition depots, command and control posts, drone operator positions, forward repair facilities, each one struck not by aircraft, not by traditional artillery, but by combinations of FPV drones, fiber optic strike drones immune to Russian electronic warfare, and long-range Ukrainian munitions. The salient began starving operationally weeks before any Ukrainian boots crossed the line of contact. Phase 2, executed through late February and into March, was kill zone construction. Ukrainian forces did not advance into Russian-held terrain in the conventional sense. They expanded a sensor and strike envelope into Russian-held terrain. Drone operators pushed forward, established new positions, extended the depth at which any Russian movement could be detected and engaged. By the time the actual ground maneuver began, Russian battalions in the salient were already cut off from reinforcement during daylight, suffering significant attrition from drones during any movement, and operating under a communications environment that had been deliberately degraded by Ukrainian electronic warfare. They were defeated before they were attacked. Phase 3 was the close quarters clearing. Small Ukrainian assault groups, often dismounted, often arriving on unmanned ground vehicles or motorcycles, moving from one settlement to the next through corridors that had been pre-sterilized of Russian infantry. The Russian positions that did resist were typically pinned, isolated and destroyed in place by drone strikes, while the assault element moved past. This is a fundamentally different model of offensive warfare than anything in standard Russian or Soviet doctrine. It is closer to what specialists are now calling a sensor strike complex maneuver, one in which territory changes hands not because of mass committed at the point of decision, but because of lethality saturated across the depth of the battle space. And here is the doctrinal verdict on what we are witnessing. The Russian army cannot do this in reverse. It cannot saturate Ukrainian rear areas with sensor strike complexes because Ukrainian drone operators outproduce, out-innovate, and outcycle their Russian counterparts at the brigade and battalion level. It cannot replicate Ukrainian electronic warfare adaptation because Russian procurement remains locked into long contract cycles that cannot keep pace with the 72-hour innovation rhythm Ukrainian engineers now operate at. It cannot mass effective fires against Ukrainian fortifications because Ukrainian counter-battery, increasingly drone-cued and AI-assisted, is killing Russian artillery faster than Russian industry can replace it. Every single doctrinal advantage Russia entered this war with, mass, fires, depth, time, has been individually neutralized by a Ukrainian adaptation cycle that has now been running uninterrupted for over 36 months. This is the larger pattern this front confirms, and I want you to hold this clearly. The war in Ukraine is no longer a contest between a larger army and a smaller army. It is a contest between an army that is still trying to fight 1985 and an army that has been forced by survival pressure to invent 2030. And on the Oleksandrivka axis, in April of 2026, the army still trying to fight 1985 ran into a wall it cannot break and was pushed backward across ground it had bled for 6 months to acquire. The strategic forecast from here is uncomfortable for anyone still invested in the narrative of inevitable Russian victory. Ukraine's counter-operation on this axis is not a one-time event. It is a template. The same sensor strike complex maneuver that broke the Oleksandrivka salient is now being prepared in modified form for application against other Russian salients across the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts. Ukrainian commanders have publicly stated that almost the entire territory of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast has been cleared of Russian forces. The salient Putin needed for his political narrative no longer exists in any meaningful form, and the Russian army that was supposed to deliver that salient is now absorbing casualties at a rate that the Russian General Staff is privately describing in terms previously reserved for the worst weeks of 2022 and 2023. History will record this period as the inflection point at which the offensive-defensive balance of the war was settled, not declared, settled, by data, by body counts, by net territorial change measured in square kilometers, and settled in favor of the side that adapted faster, decided faster, and innovated faster, which is to say, not the side with the larger population, the deeper budget, or the louder propaganda apparatus. The broader lesson here is one that Western strategic culture has been slow to absorb. Wars in the 21st century are not won by the army with the most equipment. They are won by the army with the shortest learning loop. Russia's learning loop runs through Moscow, through procurement bureaucracies, through political loyalty tests, through the inertia of an officer corps trained to follow orders that no longer match the battlefield. Ukraine's learning loop runs from the soldier in the trench to the engineer in the basement workshop, to the drone operator 3 kilometers back, to the brigade commander on a tablet, and back to the front, in cycles measured in days, sometimes in hours. That asymmetry is the war. Everything else is commentary on the war. So when you see headlines describing Putin being forced to retreat on the Oleksandrivka axis, understand what you are actually being told. You are being told that the structural asymmetry has finally produced a visible operational result of a scale that even Russian state media cannot bury under noise. You are being told that the first net monthly loss of Russian-held Ukrainian territory in over 20 months has appeared, and that it appeared exactly where Putin staked his political reputation. You are being told that one front, one sector, one corridor has just delivered the first confirmed measurement of the offensive ceiling of the Russian army in 2026, and that ceiling is well below what the Kremlin needs to win this war on any timeline its political system can sustain. The question that remains open, and the one I will be tracking with you in the coming weeks, is whether this is an isolated reversal or the leading edge of a generalized Russian operational collapse across multiple sectors. The early indicators, the casualty rates against the fortress belt, the deep strike campaign against Russian refining, the fuel rationing inside Russia itself, the freezing of Russian advance rates from 9.76 to 2.9 square kilometers per day, all point in the same direction. But wars do not move in straight lines. Russia will respond. New formations are being committed. New strike packages are being prepared against Ukrainian cities. The summer of 2026 will be brutal in ways neither side has yet shown publicly. What I can tell you with certainty is this. The Oleksandrivka retreat is not a story about a few villages on a map. It is the visible surface of a structural defeat that has been gathering inside the Russian war machine for over a year, and it has now broken into the daylight. The map is moving in the other direction. The arithmetic has tipped, and the side that has spent 2.5 years being underestimated by everyone, including some of its own Western partners, has just demonstrated that it can not only hold ground, it can take it back. Stay with this channel, because the next several weeks are going to determine whether what happened on the Oleksandrivka axis was the exception or the rule. The data is going to keep arriving, the maps are going to keep changing, and the strategic picture that has been forming underneath the surface of this war for over a year is finally becoming visible to anyone willing to read the indicators carefully. I will be reading them with you every step of the way. If you want this kind of analysis to keep reaching you, take 1 second right now and subscribe to the channel. We are pushing toward the next subscriber milestone, and every single one of you who hits that button helps this work reach the audience it needs to reach. The headlines will not tell you what I just told you. The cable shows will not connect these dots, but we will, together, one front at a time, one verdict at a time, until the structural truth of this war is impossible to ignore. Putin has been forced to retreat. The question is no longer whether he can resume the offensive. The question is whether he can hold what he has left. And that is a very different war than the one he started. Stay with us. The next update is already taking shape.